There is a kind of wound that doesn't bleed, it doesn't bruise, it doesn't leave a scar you can point to and say, that's where it happened. It lives somewhere quieter than that, somewhere in the way you apologize before you've even done anything wrong. In the way you shrink yourself just a little when you walk into a room full of people. In the way you feel vaguely guilty for having needs at all. Nobody hurt you the way people mean when they say hurt, and yet something was taken, something essential. Something that was supposed to be there and simply wasn't. That absence is the whole story. Think about a child, any child, reaching out. Not dramatically, not with tears or tantrums, just reaching, a drawing held up, a story started, a small hand tugging at a sleeve. That reach is one of the most human things there is. It says, I exist, do you see me? And when someone reaches back, even gently, even briefly, something inside that child settles. A quiet internal confirmation happens. I am real, I matter. The world is a place that responds to me. But what happens when nothing reaches back? Not cruelty, not anger, just nothing. Eyes that drift elsewhere. Attention that was always just slightly out of reach. A parent physically present, but emotionally somewhere else entirely. The child reaches and reaches and reaches, and the silence teaches them something they were never meant to learn so young. It teaches them that the reaching itself was the problem, so they stop. They fold the need up very carefully and tuck it somewhere deep, and they learn to look like they're fine. And often, they become very, very good at it. This is where it begins, not with a single dramatic moment, but with the slow, quiet erosion of a child's belief that their inner world is worth anything at all. Psychologists have a name for this: childhood emotional neglect. And the reason it took so long to be properly studied, properly named, properly taken seriously, is the same reason it's so hard to heal from. It is defined entirely by absence. You cannot point to the event because the event is the non-event. The hug that never came, the conversation that never happened, the moment someone should have sat down beside you and said, I see that you're hurting, and instead just walked past. You cannot write a memoir about the time no one came, and so people who lived this carry something deeply disorienting with them into adulthood. They know intellectually that their childhood wasn't perfect, but they also can't fully justify their own pain because nothing looks bad enough from the outside. The house was standing, there was food, nobody hit anyone. By the visible metrics, everything was fine. And that gap between what they feel and what they can prove becomes its own kind of suffering. You start to wonder if you're being dramatic, if you're inventing problems, if you are somehow the problem. You are not the problem. What happened to you was real. The marks it left are real. And just because they're invisible to everyone else doesn't mean they haven't shaped every room you've ever walked into, every relationship you've ever tried to build, every moment you've ever talked yourself out of asking for what you needed. Let's go deeper into what actually happens inside a child who grows up emotionally unseen. Because this is where it gets both painful and important. There is a process that mental psychologists call emotional mirroring. It sounds clinical, but the reality of it is remarkably tender. When a caregiver looks at a child and reflects their emotions back, when they say you seem sad right now, or I can see that really scared you, they are doing something far more significant than being kind. They are teaching that child that emotions exist, that they're nameable, that they are real things happening to a real person who matters. This is how we learn to understand our own interior worlds, not from inside out, but from outside in first. We need someone else to show us our own emotional landscape before we can navigate it ourselves. It is one of the most profound dependencies of early human development, and we almost never talk about it. When that mirroring is consistently absent, the child grows into an adult who is, in a very literal neurological sense, partially blind to their own emotional states. There is a clinical term for the most severe version of this alexithymia: difficulty identifying and describing your own feelings. And studies have repeatedly found higher rates of it in people who experienced emotional neglect in childhood. This isn't metaphor, this is measurable. The emotional vocabulary simply didn't develop fully because nobody spoke that language to them when it mattered. Imagine spending your entire life trying to read a map of a place you've never seen, in a language you were never properly taught. That's what navigating adulthood feels like for someone who grew up emotionally ignored. Not dramatic confusion, not obvious dysfunction, just a kind of persistent, low-grade disorientation, a feeling that everyone else seems to understand something about being human that they somehow missed. Jonas Webb, the clinician who formally brought childhood emotional neglect into the mainstream psychological conversation, describes patients who come to her not with clear complaints, but with something harder to articulate: a flatness, a life experienced slightly behind glass, a vague sense that they are always watching other people feel things fully while they themselves are somehow removed from the experience. Not depression exactly, not anxiety in the clinical checklist sense, something more fundamental than either: a disconnection from their own aliveness. And here is where it starts to look like 100 different things that get misdiagnosed, misunderstood, or simply dismissed. The person who cannot accept a compliment without deflecting, who laughs it off or immediately returns it, or finds some way to make it disappear before it can land. You might think that's just humility or politeness, but watch more carefully. Watch what happens in their eyes in the half-second before the deflection. There is something there, something almost panicked, as if being truly seen, even positively, is a kind of exposure they've never learned to tolerate. Because for a long time being seen didn't lead to warmth, it led to nothing, or worse, to something uncomfortable. The person who consistently overperforms, who is the most reliable, most competent, most self-sufficient person in every room, who becomes quietly indispensable because somewhere along the way they understood, not consciously but in their bones, that value had to be earned, that their mere existence was not enough to guarantee anyone's attention, so they made themselves impossible to ignore through usefulness, through achievement, through never ever needing anything from anyone. That looks like strength. It is also exhausting beyond description, and it is also, beneath everything, loneliness, wearing the costume of capability. The person who finds genuine intimacy almost physically uncomfortable, who wants closeness desperately, privately, but when it arrives, when someone loves them consistently and without condition, something in them braces, waits, scans for the withdrawal that logic tells them must be coming, because love was not a steady thing when they were learning what love was. It was unpredictable. It was something that appeared and disappeared without explanation, and so their nervous system never learned to rest inside of it. Instead, it learned to monitor, to stay ready, to never fully exhale. This is not a character flaw. This is an adaptation. A 2024 scoping review published in Child Abuse and Neglect analyzed 25 separate studies and found consistent evidence that emotional neglect in childhood leads to significant difficulties with emotional regulation in adulthood, not sometimes, consistently, across demographics, across cultures, across different definitions of what neglect looked like. And the researchers noted carefully, almost apologetically, that emotional neglect remains one of the least studied, least funded, least understood areas of childhood adversity. The wound that's hardest to see is also the one we've invested the least in understanding. There is something almost unbearably fitting about that. Because the ignored child grew up in a world that didn't notice what was happening to them. And they have grown into adults living in a field of psychology that, until relatively recently, didn't either. The invisibility follows them everywhere, even into the literature about their own pain. But here is where something important starts to shift. Because everything we've just walked through, the alexithymia, the compulsive self, sufficiency, the flinching away from intimacy, the constant low-grade sense of not quite belonging to your own life, none of it was random, none of it was weakness, none of it was a personality defect that appeared from nowhere. Every single one of those patterns was once a solution. The child who went quiet didn't go quiet because they were broken. They went quiet because quiet kept them safe in a home where noise didn't bring comfort. It brought nothing, or worse, irritation. The child who became brilliantly self-reliant didn't do that because they were cold. They did it because needing people had proven, again and again, to be a strategy that didn't work. The child who learned to read every room for emotional cues, who became hypervigilant to other people's moods and needs while remaining disconnected from their own. They weren't born anxious. They built that skill because it was the only navigation system available to them. They were incredibly intelligent children doing the best possible thing with what they had. The tragedy isn't that they developed these adaptations. The tragedy is that we don't automatically shed them when we no longer need them. The body doesn't get a notification that the environment has changed. It keeps running the old software because the old software kept you alive, and the body is, above all else, loyal to survival. So you're not in that house anymore, but parts of you haven't fully left it yet. So you're not in that house anymore, but parts of you haven't fully left it yet. Still flinching when someone gets genuinely close. Still feeling that strange unease when someone is kind to you without reason, without agenda, without conditions. Still moving through your own emotional world like a stranger in a city with no map and no language. But here is what I want you to hold on to right now. The fact that you feel this, that something in this resonated, that some quiet part of you recognized itself in these words, that is not a small thing. That recognition is your nervous system doing something it perhaps never learned to do properly when it mattered most. It is echoing something back to itself, faintly, imperfectly, but genuinely, and that is where healing begins. Not in a therapist's office necessarily, not in a dramatic breakthrough moment, not in finally finding the exact right words to explain your childhood to someone who will understand. It begins in the smallest possible act of self-witness, noticing you're angry and not immediately telling yourself you're overreacting, receiving a kind word and pausing, just for a second, before you deflect it away, feeling lonely and allowing that feeling to exist without rushing to prove to yourself that you don't need anyone. These moments sound almost embarrassingly small until you understand what they actually are. They are you becoming, slowly and imperfectly, the witness you never had. You are learning to echo yourself back. That doesn't happen overnight. Grieving in absence is one of the strangest forms of grief there is. How do you mourn something that never happened? How do you process a feeling with no specific memory attached to it? Slowly, it turns out, with enormous patience, and usually with help, but it starts with one quiet decision. The decision that your inner world is worth paying attention to, that your needs were never the problem, that the silence you grew up inside was never a verdict on your worth.